Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special episode of the Quarantine Tapes. I'm your host, John Payne, and today we're going to be talking about Mark and Patricia McCloskey, the St. Louis homeowners who pointed weapons at a group of protesters marching to St. Louis Mayor Lyda Krewson's house last weekend. Now, I've lived in the St. Louis area almost my entire adult life, and I think there are some key pieces of context that have frequently been left out of national and even local coverage of the story. So I'm here to give you all information that will help you see the broader issues at play here. The first thing that I think most people from outside of St. Louis don't understand is that this took place in a densely populated area of the city's central corridor. The news reports refer to Portland Place, where this occurred, as a private street or gated community, which probably conjures up visions of country manners way out in the exurbs. No, not at all. This neighborhood is about a half mile away from the busiest interchange in the city of St. Louis and within walking distance of Barnes Jewish Hospital, which is the city's largest employer, and the Washington University School of Medicine. The street is indeed considered private property, and to explain that, we need to explain some St. Louis history. In the late 19th century, the downtown area of the city had become crowded and polluted, so the city's wealthiest residents built new, expansive homes in what was then the sparsely populated western edge of the city. The city did not offer robust public services at the time, so the original owners created associations to pave and maintain streets, streetlights, sidewalks, sewers, and essentially every service that would now be provided by the city or a public utility. They were truly independent and fairly remote at the time, so there was little reason to doubt their status as totally private places. And that all seems fairly unobjectionable, but providing utilities was not the only activity these homeowners associations engaged in. They also enforced covenants that restricted the right of homeowners to sell to certain groups of people, blacks first and foremost. In 1945, a black family attempted to buy a house in Lewis Place, another of St. Louis's private neighborhoods, and the sale was blocked by another neighborhood resident who lived several blocks away. The legal fight eventually made its way all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in the form of Shelley versus Kramer, and the court ruled that restrictive racial covenants were not illegal, but they were unenforceable. The court argued that private parties could make whatever kind of contract between themselves that they wanted, but if the courts were used to enforce that contract, that represented state action. The 14th Amendment forbid state entities from discriminating against anyone on the basis of race, so these contracts could not be enforced by the courts. And as the city grew around them, these neighborhoods also became less private in terms of the provision of services as well. Today, public entities or utilities provide electricity, sewer, gas, street cleaning, police, and fire services to all of these neighborhoods. The only function the associations still really perform is the maintenance of the streets and sidewalks. Now, I am someone who is very supportive of private property rights, but property has to be justly acquired for those rights to be justified. If these neighborhoods now receive public services in roughly the same way the rest of the city does, why shouldn't they be treated as any other neighborhood would be? Yes, maintaining the roads and sidewalks is a valuable role, but there are now a ton of transportation and community improvement districts that do the same thing across the city. None of them are allowed to exclude the public from these amenities because they receive tax funding. And, in practice, the general public does have some access to these private places. I lived next to one when I was an undergrad at Washington University, and despite it being marked private, I walked through the area frequently. I don't recall ever being stopped by anyone during the day. At night, security definitely patrolled the area and would tell you to go home if you were walking through the neighborhood, but I never would have expected a homeowner to point a pistol at me for being in the area. And according to people I know who have lived near Portland Place, the same practice prevails there. Pedestrians walk through the neighborhood during the day with no incident. That regular and prolonged use by pedestrians could create a prescriptive easement on that land. Now, note, I am not an attorney, so this should not be construed as a legal opinion. But I am frequently attorney adjacent, so I know a decent amount for a layman. The basic idea of a prescriptive easement is that if people use a piece of property for a specific purpose, such as a walking path, for a long enough time, the property can still be privately owned, but the owner has surrendered the right to exclude people from that use. And in a twist so ironic that a Hollywood writer couldn't have scripted it, the McCloskeys have been using a similar legal tactic to take some of the exact property in question from the homeowners association. Under a concept called adverse possession, the McCloskeys have been engaged in a 30-year strategy to take the gatehouse that the protesters passed through from the homeowners association, which currently owns it according to the city. So, what is adverse possession, you ask? Well, essentially, it's where you openly trespass on someone else's property long enough that you can become the legal owner of the property. The underlying idea is that if a property owner is not actually using the property, someone else can effectively homestead that property right. The problem in this case is that the homeowners association appears to be quite intent on keeping the property and have been fighting the McCloskeys over it for years, including in a lawsuit since 2017. And I strongly encourage you to read the McCloskeys affidavit in the case, because it is crazy. Here are a couple good excerpts. Quote, in order to replace such cable, the trustees sought to access property owned by the McCloskeys, including property in the parcel. Consequently, the trustees, by and through their attorney Marvin Notiff, drafted a license agreement whereby the McCloskeys gave the trustees a one-time license to enter and perform work on the McCloskeys' property, which included the parcel. In the course of doing the work pursuant to such license agreement, the trustees damaged and killed various shrubs which the McCloskeys had planted in the parcel. And, in conformity with the license agreement, the trustees paid for the shrubbery which they damaged or killed in connection with replacing such cable. So basically, we're dealing with people who are obsessed with shrubberies and paying for them. So, something like this. A shrubbery! Here's another quote. Prior to the installation of the new wall, residents and trespassers could physically gain access to Portland Place by stepping over the broken existing wall at 1 Portland Place and cross across the parcel to the Portland Place sidewalk. Between the time of acquisition of 1 Portland Place and the construction of the above-referenced 10-foot wall, the McCloskeys regularly prohibited all persons, including Portland Place residents, from crossing the parcel, including at least at one point, challenging a resident at gunpoint who refused to heed the McCloskeys' warnings to stay off such property. So the McCloskeys are admitting, in their own affidavit, that they threatened one of the residents of the neighborhood, who has just as much of a claim to this property as they do, according to the city, by brandishing a firearm at him. It's important to understand that the McCloskeys had a court hearing in the adverse possession case in the days after the incident with the protesters, and I think that plays into their decision-making here. To win an adverse possession case and legally take the property, they have to show exclusive and continuous possession. So that means that they need to make a big show of expelling anyone who enters the property, which again does not belong to them unless they win this court case. And whether that's a neighbor or a group of protesters, it doesn't matter. The McCloskeys have been trying to take this property since they moved into the house in 1988, and they are both trial attorneys well attuned to the facts that they need to present to prevail in court. So we should view their actions here through that prism. If this is what drove their actions, they weren't in fear for their life or freaked out about a broken gate, which was not actually broken when the McCloskeys brandished their firearms, by the way. They were simply a couple of trial attorneys creating a set of facts that would help them in a long-standing legal battle that the protesters knew nothing about. Now, I am not aware of any video showing interactions with the McCloskeys and the protesters prior to them brandishing their weapons. But I find it implausible that if the protesters were coming through and making threats to homeowners, that the McCloskeys are the only ones saying something about it. Where's the corroboration here? A bunch of their neighbors released a statement siding with the protesters against the McCloskeys. I just can't see that happening if this was the dangerous mob that the McCloskeys are portraying. But I think there's a broader story here than these extraordinarily wealthy people with their insane rich people problems. These properties and the whole central corridor of the city have been lavished with special treatment by the city and the state for decades. I can practically guarantee that this property received historic tax credits and tax abatement while they refurbished it. It is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and I'm sure that does wonders for property values. The developments that surround it have been heavily subsidized by all levels of government. Contrast this with the north and south sides of the city, which have been largely passed over when it comes time to divvy up the economic development tax credits and subsidies. That is, with the exception of when a giant developer wants to come in and condemn whole blocks of neighborhoods through eminent domain and kick all the existing businesses and residents out. The city has been quite prepared to give proposals like that tens of millions of dollars in economic incentives. But when it comes to helping the current residents, the Central West End, where the McCloskeys live, gets a lot more in development tax dollars and government services than, say, Fountain Park on the north side or Marine Villa, where I live on the south side. The point I am making here is that the McCloskeys' home is government-subsidized housing. As a term we usually only apply to housing for poor people, but I guarantee you that the McCloskeys have received far more preferential financial treatment from the government than anyone in a housing project. So at what point should we not consider this street to be private? My thinking is that once you start asking for special treatment from the government, you shouldn't get to exclude the public from something that is generally a public amenity. And there is one more dimension of this case that I want to highlight because it hits home personally. Back in 1992, the McCloskeys demanded that the Homeowners Association keep its original restrictions that prohibited selling to any cohabiting unmarried couple. Now, what that really meant at that time is that they were banning gay couples from living there because gays could not legally be married in 1992. So if my husband and I had been living in St. Louis at the time, we would have been paying higher taxes to support the lower taxes, subsidies, and greater government services received by the McCloskeys on Portland Place, but we could not ever hope to buy a home there because the association covenant denied us that right. I'm all for private property, and if a bigoted couple like the McCloskeys doesn't want to sell me their house, I can live with that. What I can't live with is them denying me that opportunity while at the same time seeking special favors from the government. So you want your private street? Fine. Pay full fucking freight like the rest of us. But if you want to grow fat off this system, you don't get to threaten the hoi polloi when they have the temerity to walk through the neighborhood they help pay for. Well, that's it for this special episode of the Quarantine Tapes. I've been your host, John Payne, and I want to thank you for watching. I would like to encourage you to share this video with your friends and colleagues on social media, then go to our Facebook and Twitter and give us a like and a follow, respectively. Finally, please check out our Patreon and subscribe to help us continue creating content like this. Thank you, and good night.